The idea that Magellan discovered the Philippines might be the most expensive myth in Southeast Asian history. Not expensive in money, expensive in identity, expensive in centuries of erased pride. And the evidence against it has been sitting in Arab manuscripts, Chinese trade records, and archaeological digs for decades. Most people just never bothered to look. To be honest, let me take you back, way back. We're talking roughly the 900s, maybe earlier. Arab geographers and traders were compiling detailed accounts of maritime routes across the Indian Ocean and into Southeast Asian waters. They weren't guessing. They were documenting what they saw. And what they saw were Filipino sailors. Skilled, fearless navigators operating sophisticated vessels across vast stretches of open sea. These weren't small fishing canoes hugging the coastline. These were balangai, large outrigger boats built with advanced plank and peg construction, capable of carrying dozens of people and significant cargo across hundreds of miles of open ocean. Arab traders didn't just notice them, they wrote about them. The geographer Abu Zayd al-Sirafi, writing around the 10th century, described encounters with seafaring peoples from the islands southeast of Borneo. His descriptions align with what we know about early Filipino maritime communities. Another key figure, al-Masudi, referenced trade networks that reached deep into the Philippine archipelago. These weren't vague footnotes. They were practical trading notes, the kind merchants wrote because accuracy meant profit and survival. So here's the problem that emerges. If Filipino seafarers were already integrated into Arab documented trade networks by the 900s, why does the dominant historical narrative begin with Magellan arriving in 1521? That gap covers roughly 600 years, 6 centuries of activity, trade, diplomacy, and navigation, reduced to a footnote or ignored entirely. Think about it. The answer isn't some grand conspiracy. It's something far more ordinary and far more frustrating. Precisely frustrating. Colonial Historiography. Spain wrote the Philippine story from 1521 onward because that's when Spain entered the picture. The Spanish didn't suppress pre-colonial records out of some secret plan. They simply didn't care. Their framework placed European arrival as the starting point of meaningful history. Really history. Everything before that? Primitive, irrelevant, not worth recording. And when you control the schools, the churches, and the government for over 300 years, your version of history becomes the default. It's not malice. It's institutional laziness combined with cultural arrogance, and the damage was enormous. But the evidence never disappeared. It just waited. In 1976, a major archaeological discovery shook things up. In Butuan, on the northeastern coast of Mindanao, researchers excavated the remains of large wooden boats. These Balangai vessels were radiocarbon dated to around the 4th century. Let that sink in. The 4th century. That's over 1,000 years before any European ship touched Philippine shores. These weren't crude rafts. The construction techniques showed sophisticated woodworking, edge-joined planks, fastened with wooden dowels, and fiber lashing. The design allowed for ocean voyaging, not just coastal hopping. This discovery created a new problem, though. A big one. How do you reconcile physical archaeological evidence from the 300s with a national historical narrative that begins in 1521? The textbooks weren't built for this. The curriculum wasn't designed to accommodate it. And many historians trained in Western academic traditions were reluctant to reframe the entire timeline. Some questioned the dating, others acknowledged the boats, but minimized their significance. A few argued the vessels might have been locally used and didn't prove long-distance trade. Then more evidence showed up. Chinese historical records from the Song dynasty, covering roughly the 960s through the 1270s, document trade relations with a polity called Ma'ai. Most scholars identify Ma'ai as Mindoro or a nearby Philippine island. The Sung Shi and later the Zhufan by Zhao Rukuo describe Ma'i traders arriving in Chinese ports with beeswax, cotton, and other goods. They came on their own ships, under their own navigation. Nobody carried them. Nobody guided them. They knew the routes, the currents, and the monsoon patterns. Stop for a second. Think about what that means practically. Navigating from the Philippines to southern China requires understanding of wind patterns across seasons. It requires knowledge of star navigation, ocean currents, and coastal landmarks across hundreds of miles. These weren't accidental journeys. They were repeated, systematic, commercial voyages. The Chinese officials who recorded these encounters treated the Ma'i traders as regular participants in maritime commerce. Not curiosities. Let's say, not savages. Trading partners. And this is where the story gets layered. Because the Arab records and the Chinese records aren't describing the same routes. They're describing different directions. Filipino sailors were trading south and west into the Malay world and the Indian Ocean network documented by Arab geographers. Simultaneously, they were trading north toward China, documented by Song Dynasty officials. This wasn't one isolated corridor. It was a multi-directional web of maritime activity radiating outward from the Philippine archipelago. So the solution to the textbook problem seemed obvious. Update the textbooks. Expand the timeline. Acknowledge the pre-colonial maritime tradition. Except that created yet another problem. A political one? Rewriting national history isn't a neutral academic exercise. In the Philippines, the Magellan arrival narrative is woven into the founding mythology of the nation. The Battle of Mactan in 1521, where Lapu-Lapu killed Magellan, serves as the origin story of Filipino resistance. It's on the money. It's in the monuments. It's taught to every child. If you push the historical starting point back by 1,000 years, you don't erase Lapu-Lapu, but you do change his context. He shifts from being the beginning of Filipino identity to being one moment in a much longer, much richer continuum. That's a hard sell politically, even when the evidence supports it. Some historians navigated this beautifully. The late William Henry Scott spent decades documenting pre-colonial Philippine societies using Spanish, Chinese, and Indigenous sources. His work showed complex social structures, legal codes, writing systems, and trade networks that predated colonization. He didn't diminish the colonial period. He contextualized it. He gave it a before. The Laguna Copperplate inscription adds another fascinating layer. Discovered in 1989 near Laguna de Bay, this thin copper plate bears an inscription dated to the year 900. The text, written in Old Malay with Sanskrit loanwords, records a debt pardon. It references places, people, and a legal transaction. The script and language show deep connections to broader Southeast Asian literary and legal traditions. This wasn't an isolated village scratching marks on metal. This was a society with written law, economic record-keeping, and cross-cultural linguistic fluency. Now, here's something that rarely gets discussed. The Laguna Copperplate doesn't just prove literacy existed in the Philippines before Spain. It proves something about networks. The Old Malay language, the Sanskrit vocabulary, the legal format, all of these connect the Philippines to the Srivijaya Empire and broader Indosphere cultural currents. Filipino societies weren't sitting in isolation waiting to be found. They were active participants in one of the most dynamic cultural and commercial zones on the planet. The Balangai Boats, the Arab geographic texts, the Chinese trade records, the Laguna Copperplate. Each piece alone might be dismissible. Together, they form a picture that's impossible to ignore. Yet here we are, decades after these discoveries, and the popular narrative has barely shifted. Why? Part of it is educational inertia. Changing curricula takes political will and institutional effort. Part of it is the global dominance of Eurocentric historical frameworks that treat the age of exploration as the moment non-European peoples entered history. And part of it, honestly, is that myths are stickier than facts. A simple story about Magellan arriving and discovering islands is easier to remember than a complex web of multi-directional trade networks spanning centuries. But the tide is turning, slowly. The Balangai Voyage project in the 2000s reconstructed traditional Balangai boats and sailed them across Southeast Asian waters, retracing ancient trade routes. The crews used traditional navigation techniques. The voyages proved these routes were practical, not theoretical. Filipino scholars like Laura Lee Junker have published extensive archaeological analyses of pre-colonial Philippine trade patterns. The evidence base keeps growing. Every year, new excavations, new artifact analyses, new reinterpretations of old texts add another layer to the picture. And there's a detail in the Arab sources that most people overlook completely. A detail that reframes everything we think we know about who was connected to whom in the medieval maritime world. But understanding its significance requires us to look at what was happening in the Strait of Malacca around the same period, and how a shift in monsoon trading patterns accidentally preserved Filipino sailors in records that were never meant to be historical documents at all. The monsoon system dictated everything. Arab and Indian traders sailing east would arrive in Southeast Asian ports during one monsoon season, then wait months for the winds to reverse before sailing home. During those waiting periods, they interacted extensively with local traders, including those from the Philippine Islands. The trading entrepôts of the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra became meeting points. Filipino goods, gold, beeswax, forest products, moved through these hubs. And the Arab merchants, meticulous record keepers for commercial purposes, noted the origins of goods and the peoples who brought them. Gold deserves special attention here. The Philippines has been a source of gold for millennia. Archaeological sites across the archipelago have yielded gold artifacts of stunning craftsmanship, death masks, jewelry, ornaments, dating to well before any European contact. When Arab traders wrote about gold from the eastern islands, they weren't imagining things. The metallurgical evidence backs them up. The Surigao treasure, a collection of gold artifacts discovered in Mindanao, includes pieces dated to the 10th through 13th centuries. The craftsmanship shows both local traditions and influences from Hindu-Buddhist artistic conventions. These weren't imports. They were made locally by Filipino goldsmiths, using local gold and blending multiple cultural influences. If you've been watching this far and you want to understand the one moment where all of this, the boats, the gold, the Arab maps, the Chinese records, converges into a single undeniable conclusion, subscribe now. Because what comes next changes the entire frame. Here's the convergence point. Around the 10th to 13th centuries, the Philippines wasn't a peripheral zone. It sat at a crossroads. To the west and south, the Srivijaya and later Majapahit empires dominated maritime trade. To the north, Song Dynasty China was the largest economy on earth. To the southwest, Arab and Indian traders connected the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. Filipino sailors didn't just passively receive these influences. They actively navigated between all of them. They carried goods, ideas, technologies, and languages across these networks. The record didn't get erased by some shadowy force. It got overshadowed. Colonial history wrote a louder story, and for centuries, that louder story drowned out the quieter, older, truer one. The Arab maps and Chinese chronicles never vanished. They sat in libraries and archives in plain sight, waiting for people to care enough to read them. So here's what you can do right now, not tomorrow, right now. Look up the Butuan Balangai excavations. Read about the Laguna Copperplate inscription. Search for Zhao Rukuo's description of Mai. These aren't hidden sources. They're available, translated, and accessible. Then share what you find with one person who still thinks Philippine history starts in 1521. Because myths don't die from academic papers. They die from conversations, one at a time.